If you've ever listened to the band System of a Down, and primarily to their singer Turks, you've probably noticed his ongoing struggle to ensure that society does not forget something called the Armenian Genocide. They have written multiple lyrics and posts on social media about this topic, they have run campaigns with photographs, and have tirelessly repeated what happened there. In fact, one of their first songs, Plug, talks about the Armenian Genocide, with this title being an acronym for Politically Lying, Unholy, Cowardly Killers, that is, Politically Lying, Unholy, and Cowardly Killers. In the same album where this song appears, there is a booklet that has the following dedication. System of a Down would like to dedicate this song to the memory of 1.5 million victims of the Armenian genocide perpetrated by the Turkish government in 1915. But what was the Armenian genocide itself? In January of 1915, the First World War was at its peak. Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had a strong ally, the Ottoman Empire. Their main authorities believed that the German victory would be key to regaining the power they had lost after the Balkan Wars, and thus keep the European powers at bay, especially Russia, the nation that threatened to take over their territory. A decisive event would be the Battle of Sarikamis. The Turkish army had prepared to incapacitate the Russian soldiers. They had resources to easily overcome the enemy. However, the Turks ended up suffering the most humiliating defeat during the war. 90,000 men would die in the conflict. The nationalist leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, did not hesitate to point out who they believed were to blame for the failure of the Armenian people. They were convinced that a handful of citizens had betrayed them by providing support to the Tsar's forces. Ready to take revenge, they accused the entire Armenian community of treason. With the support of the German government, they set in motion Directive 8682. In this way, the Armenian soldiers who were part of the Ottoman army were disarmed and sent to forced labor camps. They were later executed, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Persecutions and massacres of entire peoples have existed since time immemorial. But it was only at the end of World War II that a way was found to name these events in an appropriate way. Rafael Lemkin, a Polish lawyer who had fled Nazi Germany, dedicated himself to denouncing the barbaric acts led by Adolf Hitler. In his book, The Axis Power in Europe, he used a novel word to refer to the Holocaust. Genocide, a term made up of the words Dino, which in Greek means tribe or race, and side, from the Latin side, which means murder. In December of 1946, the UN declared genocide a crime under international law. Since then, a large number of genocides have been recorded and condemned, such as the Great Purge, which took place in the Soviet Union during the 30s, the Cultural Revolution in Mao Zedong's China, and those that occurred in Cambodia and Rwanda. But there was one of monstrous proportions, one that to this day continues to affect the citizens of Armenia and around the world. To know the details of it, we have to go back to April 24th, 1915, the day the Armenian Genocide began. The history of Armenia is as old as humanity. Some archaeological studies indicate that it was one of the areas where the first civilization settled. The most emblematic dates back to 2493 BC when Haik, a hero descendant of Noah, defeated Bel, the tyrant of Babylon, by shooting him with an arrow near Mount Ararat. The feat occurred on August 11th, which would be taken as Navasart, or Armenian New Year. The Armenians emerged in the Caucasus and Armenian Plateau, becoming the first state to adopt Christianity as its official religion in 301 AD. They also promoted a culture that would have a long reach in Europe and Asia, but from those mythical origins, the history of Armenia was marked by political conflicts, invasions, and violence. The fights for sovereignty were constant. Between the 4th and 20th centuries, it was partitioned more than once, to the point that there existed Eastern Armenia and Western Armenia. The latter was conquered in the 16th century by the Ottoman Empire, also known as the Turkish Empire, one of the most imposing and hegemonic of ancient times, as it extended across Europe, Asia, and Africa. But the relationship of the Armenians with the empire was always difficult. Power was in the hands of a Muslim elite, and other religious groups had to organize themselves into communities called millet. This policy blocked their access to many rights and resources, including horses and weapons, in addition to prohibiting marriages with Muslim women. They also had to pay very high taxes. Despite everything, the Armenians were able to develop autonomy with their policies and culture. There were peasants and craftsmen, but then merchants, bankers, and doctors appeared. Some citizens prospered, giving rise to a bourgeoisie. Many young people were able to attend European universities and become professionals. Instead of pursuing a career abroad, a large group of these young people returned to their homeland to implement improvements. They had become aware of the situation in which their compatriots were living, so they set out to change the future. Thus was born an intellectual movement that created its own political parties to defend their rights. They had the support of the Christian nations, who looked at them with respect. The Ottoman Empire had a very negative view of the evolution of the Armenian people. If they grew, they would no longer be so easy to subdue. The Ottomans were especially concerned about their proximity to Tsarist Russia, a historical rival of the Turks. This generated in the imperial authorities a hatred that began to translate into increasingly violent episodes. The first Ottoman attack against the Armenians dates back to 1894. By then, the empire was going through its most alarming period. They had lost territories after the war against the Russians, which took place in 1877 and 1878. Previously, they had endured Greece's independence. In addition, a strong economic and social crisis was on the rise, but the greatest concern remained the advance of Russia. In that context, Sultan Abdulhamid II blamed the Armenian people for collaborating with the enemy to foster hatred, but there was also another reason. He thought they were compromising the political and racial purity of his domains. So he convinced the other Muslim peoples that the Armenians represented a danger and they had to pay the consequences. The Sultan's opportunity arose from the Sassoon uprising in where the Armenians tried to rebel against the Ottoman army and Kurdish paramilitary groups. They demanded more rights and a democracy. The fight for equality was used to justify the genocide of minority groups. By the time the killing ended in 1896, the number of Armenians killed amounted to 300,000. For these massacres, Abdulhamid II was known as the Red Sultan or the Butcher of Armenians. He consolidated his status and regained stability, at least temporarily. The Armenians had suffered a first devastating blow, but it was only the beginning of the nightmare. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had begun to decline. Unlike other nations that were developing industries and adapting to the new world, Abdulhamid II did not carry out any reforms. It had weakened, and the people were demanding new faces, with a different vision. Hopes took shape in 1908 when a nationalist political party emerged, influenced by the French Revolution. It was the Committee of Union and Progress, led by those who would be called the Young Turks. These new leaders were Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha. At that time, Pasha was the title carried by men with a higher command in the army, but it was also used by governors. The three forced the reinstatement of the 1876 constitution, suspended by the Sultan, and claimed to respect individual freedoms and ethnic rights. They brought ideas that swept away the imperial tradition. Minorities like the Armenians had reasons to feel that an era of persecution and murder was ending. They gave him all their support through their political party, Tashnak Sutun, and braced for the worst. But the ordeal had no end. Abdulhamid II intended to regain power, and in March of 1909, he led a counter-revolution. The emperor was able to enjoy his faculties again, so he demanded the restitution of Islamic law. His loyalists responded fervently and blamed the Armenian people for providing unconditional support to the Young Turks. More precisely, to the Armenians of Adana, one of the most prosperous cities. Another massacre would happen right there. When Abdulhamid II returned to power, the Muslims were ready to fight against anyone who opposed the regime. Alarms were triggered as they were carried away by an increasingly prominent rumor. The Armenians of Adana were planning an uprising. Without wasting time, in April of 1909 they invaded the city, looted homes, and then set them on fire, but above all they murdered the locals. After destroying Adana, they proceeded to other cities and provinces, including Tarsus and Marash. The survivors tried to take refuge in foreign embassies, and soon British cruisers arrived with provisions and medicines. None of those diplomats could prevent the perverse nature of the massacres. The Armenians were burned alive or mutilated before being shot to death. A massacre that was complicit with the Ottoman army, which was supposedly sent to maintain peace. Finally, Abdul Hamid II was overthrown and replaced by his brother, Mehmed V, a figure functional to the Young Turks. By then, 20,000 to 30,000 Armenians had perished. The Adana massacre was another hard blow to the Armenian community. However, it continued to be the precursor to extermination on a scale never imagined. Now, without the threat of the sultans, the Young Turks could apply their promise of a more tolerant government, free from despotism. But soon after, they started exhibiting intense nationalism that belied their statements. In itself, the complicit attitude of the army during the Adana massacre showed that their intentions were dark. The Young Turks sought to purify the empire to restore it to its greatness, but in their own way. They wanted a modern Turkish state, without religious influence and of a homogeneous character. That's why they believed it was essential to get rid of all minorities, as they believed contaminated Turkish society. Once again, Armenians were scapegoated. Like the Muslims, the Turks considered them a threat due to their solid political and social formation, and mainly because many of them were close to Russian ideas. The Young Turks' intentions to liquidate the Armenians date back to 1910. There were no further advances until 4 years later, when the First World War began. The nationalist leaders swiftly allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Victory on that side could guarantee the momentum that the Ottoman Empire needed. As the Russians were the most direct enemy, suspicions that the Armenians would be on their side increased their prejudices. And those suspicions turned into hatred after the fiasco of the Battle of Sarikamis that led to Directive 8682, and that brings our story full circle. As in prior years, the Ottoman Empire targeted the Armenian people. The Young Turks began a smear campaign accusing them of disloyalty and treason. According to the propaganda, they posed a threat to national security, and it was only a matter of time until they rose up in Istanbul and flung open the doors to Tsarist Russia. Even though there were no signs that this was going to happen, the leaders began what would later be known as the Armenian Genocide. It all began on April 24th, 1915, when the Young Turks authorized the arrest of over 600 intellectuals, doctors, deputies, architects, lawyers, and other prominent figures of the Armenian people. They were accused of plotting against the empire. That same night, they were locked up, and in the following days, they were deported or executed. The government's action deprived the Armenians of their representatives. They were now defenseless and broken. To make matters worse, signals of approval for the atrocities were coming from Germany. As they saw it, they were only suppressing riots. But that first movement was the tip of the iceberg of a massacre that extended for years. The large-scale attack against the Armenians had just been launched. It was an initiative as sinister as it was ambitious. The Young Turks dissolved the Congress and implemented the 10 Commandments of the Union and Progress Committee, which consisted of 10 articles detailing the careful planning of the genocide. Some had already been implemented, and others would be applied in the following years. The first article accounted for the arrest and murder of Armenian authorities. The second emphasized the seizure of their weapons. The third involved tarnishing the image of the Armenians, organizing planned incidents to exacerbate the hatred that Muslims already felt. The fourth article allowed for the total implementation of the actions to the general population. The fifth imposed the annihilation of school teachers and every man under 50 years old, although women and children would be left alive to be converted to Islam. The sixth required taking the families of the citizens who had escaped and ensuring that they cut the ties that bound them to their homes. The seventh article licensed the dismissal of Armenian officers from government posts under the charge of espionage. The eighth article called for the removal of active Armenian military personnel. The ninth proposed to start all measures at the same time, so that the Armenians would not have time to defend themselves. And the 10th article urged to keep these commandments in the utmost privacy. Based on these commandments, the genocide was organized from the Ministry of the Interior, where governors, police, and armed paramilitary groups were directed. In addition, everything was divided into 3 stages. The first began on April 24th with the arrest, deportation, and killing of Armenian leaders. This also includes the campaign against the people, accused of being traitors and conspirators to the Muslims. The second stage focused on killing men aged 1840 as they posed the greatest resistance threat. More than 60,000 of those individuals were placed in the Ottoman army to be executed. They were forced to dig their own graves before receiving the fatal shots. The third and final stage was no less terrible. The Armenians were deported to the deserts of Syria and Mesopotamia. Most were women, children, and the elderly, all subjected to the most indescribable tortures. Those who did not die on the journey ended up being executed when they arrived at their destination. The women could not avoid being violated, converted to Islam, and forced to become wives of Muslim patriarchs. Some villages escaped the empire to safe territories like the Caucasus, Balkans, and certain Arab provinces. Sometimes they had the help of Turks and Muslims who did not share the extremist ideas of the government. Nevertheless, their numbers remained small. In addition, the purification plan included the killing of more than 300,000 Greeks and a similar number of Assyrians. That chain of atrocities extended for years and seemed to have no end, but it had begun to attract the world's attention. The genocide against the Armenians never left the international powers indifferent, especially those that faced Germany in World War I. In May of 1915, Russia, France, and Great Britain issued a statement in which they warned about the massacres and used for the first time a term that would become common: crimes against humanity. The United States Senate also spoke out a year later. Similarly, major news outlets reported the atrocities in full, including the grisliest details. Despite global attention, the injustices couldn't be stopped. They were unable to counteract the policy of the Young Turks. But some ambassadors from neutral countries tried to do something about it. The United States consul allowed the children to take refuge in the consulate. Others were rescued by British and French ships. For their part, Germany and Austria remained silent, maintaining that these were internal matters of Turkey. But the situation of the Armenians began to change at the end of 1918. The Turkish defeat in World War I led their authorities to sign the Armistice of Mudros. Thus, the Ottomans had to abandon the empire with the exception of Anatolia. Now France and England were able to enter Constantinople and soon divided control of the Ottoman provinces. The genocide against the Armenian people had ended, but the investigations revealed chilling figures. The number of Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire was around 2,100,000. Over 1.5 million people were exterminated. The Young Turks were arrested, although some managed to escape. Soon Turkey had new authorities who wasted no time in judging their predecessors. In June of 1919, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Cemal Pasha, along with many of their lieutenants, had to answer before a court-martial. The verdict came a month later. The Pashas received a death sentence for rebellion. However, the sentences were not executed. That did not save them from a fate as cruel as their actions. Between 1921 and 1922, all three were assassinated by Armenians in successive attacks. As for the Armenian people, they were able to achieve the long-awaited independence in 1920 when the Treaty of Sèvres was signed, a peace agreement between the Ottoman Empire and the Allied countries. Although it was never ratified, the Great Armenia or United Armenia emerged. However, many had emigrated to countries such as Greece, France, and the United States, where they started a new life. The perpetrators of the genocide were dead, and the geography of Europe and Asia had changed radically. Nevertheless, peace eluded the Armenian community. In July of 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne recognized the sovereignty of the Republic of Turkey, a successor state of the Ottoman Empire. This document included Annex 8, titled Amnesty Declaration, so immunity was granted to those responsible for crimes linked to political events committed between 1914 and 1922. The Armenian people seemed doomed to suffer calamities, but they were far from being crushed by the weight of history. The Armenian genocide was documented in numerous testimonies and records. However, Turkey still clings to an unyielding denial. And not only that, the Young Turks are remembered as heroes who acted in a war context. On the other hand, the genocide was recognized by 32 countries through some of their powers. Uruguay was the first, followed by France, Canada, Denmark, Argentina, Vatican City, and Germany. Due to the efforts of other countries, the genocide against Armenians is now remembered. In fact, it reminds us of the levels of cruelty that humans can reach in the name of politics and supposed peace.